Well, good afternoon and a warm welcome from London, wherever in the world you might be. This corporate partner briefing is on the role of aviation in achieving net zero, important and topical subject. And in particular, welcome to our speaker, Chris Stark, who is the Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change. And the schedule for this event will be, Chris will give his presentation. We'll follow that with a Q&A session, aiming to finish at 1700 UK time. And please do add your questions as you think of them rather than waiting until the end. Now let me say a little more about Chris and the subject for this afternoon. Chris is the Chief Executive of the UK Committee on Climate Change, which is the public body tasked by the Climate Change Act to be the independent authority on tackling climate change. This leads a team of analysts and specialists offering expert insight, and they are experts, into the challenges of reducing UK emissions and adapting to the changing climate. He's worked at senior level in other government departments and was previously Director of Energy and Climate Change in the Scottish Government. So, to the role of aviation in achieving net zero. In terms of aviation, the committee's work has reached an important stage with the publication of the 6th carbon budget. It's important for 3 reasons for us. First, because the budget is full scope in that it includes international aviation. Secondly, because it recognises that aviation will still provide some positive emissions by 2050. And thirdly, because it requires increased ambition and a faster fall than previous budgets did. It also includes demand management as a factor, something that we're getting used to. And while it shouldn't be seen as it's undoubtedly a factor that regulates the number of new aircraft that will be produced over the next 30 years. And we've seen a variety of propositions in the past 12 months. The trade body Sustainable Aviation felt that the measure outlined in their report could allow a 70% growth, albeit underpinned by carbon pricing. The Cambridge group, Absolute Zero, recommended that we should stop flying entirely by 2050 and close all UK airports except Heathrow, Glasgow and Belfast by 2030. So, given that the Committee on Climate Change is the main source of advice to government on these matters, we should listen very carefully to what Chris has to say. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Sir Brian. And just as you say, I'm going to try and take you through, in particular, the things that we've published very recently on aviation. The 6th carbon budget work was a real step forward, I think. So I'm going to try and show my screen if I can. Let's see if this works. This is always the bit that doesn't work. And hopefully you can see that now. Let me see if I can just go back to this here. Very good. Can you see that, Brian?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Very good. All right. Let's get started, shall we? Let me say, first of all, good afternoon to you all, and thank you so much for having me today. It's a real pleasure, of course, to speak to you. Before we get into this, just a few introductory comments from me. Brian, you raised some of the big issues in your introduction. This is one of the key topics, really, when it comes to net zero. Aviation is a hot topic, however you look at it, and to my mind, aviation and climate change have become really intertwined recently, sometimes quite in an unhelpful way. I feel like many of the important messages and the subtleties that we need to be discussing on climate's role in net zero have been lost a bit in what can be a really emotive discussion. So I'm going to try and cut through that today. I am going to draw on that latest piece of advice that you referred to, Brian, that we published just in December. And just to say from the top that if any of you haven't had the chance to go and look at that advice, do so. You can find it on our website, and there's a particularly good summary of the aviation issues that you'll find under the 6th carbon budget section on the website. So I'm going to try and draw on that today. But just to acknowledge from the start that this is a sector that faces more uncertainty, I think, in the journey to net zero than most. So I'm wary here in presenting anything that gives you a sense of too much false authority. So I like to think we are the authority here, but there is still a great deal of uncertainty on how aviation will play its role in achieving net zero in the UK and globally. Secondly, one of those big uncertainties at the moment is COVID, and that is clouding the outlook very obviously. And I know how difficult the issues facing aviation are going to be for the foreseeable. So lots of questions about how quickly demand will return, or even whether it's going to return. That also plays into the discussion on climate very obviously. I'm going to have a go today at clarifying how we see things on that front. I hope I'm going to be able to convince you today that net zero can sit alongside the recovery from COVID for the aviation sector. I don't think it is too much of an ask for us to recover from COVID whilst tackling net zero for aviation, and not least because many of the recommendations that we have are cost saving in the round for the sector. So that's something that we'll come back to at the end, I hope. We're about to enter a period of new policy, new strategy. I think this is going to be an unprecedented period ahead for those of us who follow climate policy and climate policy as it pertains to aviation. We've got the Jet Zero Council. We're promised new plans for decarbonising aviation from the Department for Transport. I think Grant Shapps has been excellent on this stuff. He's a pilot and a Tesla driver, so perhaps that's to be expected. And lastly, I know this audience is going to be aware that this year in my hometown of Glasgow, where I'm joining you from today, we're going to be hosting the next major climate summit, COP26. That's going to be a really important moment. Aviation's not formally on the agenda for COP26, but I would be amazed if it wasn't a talking point. So some of the things that we'll talk about today are going to be relevant, I think, to that story as it plays out over the course of this year. So my main aim, I suppose, today is to get you thinking about the year ahead. And let's begin with a reminder about what all this is about. And I have a bit longer today, so I thought I would just start with this. And you know, this is important. This is the record of the carbon dioxide that we've had in our atmosphere for 800,000 years, which we have because we can look at the bubbles that are trapped in the ice at the poles. And this is a lovely record of how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years, nearly 1 million years of CO2 concentrations in the global atmosphere that you see here. And you see that natural carbon cycle over the course of that period. What we've been doing recently is utterly remarkable. If I just draw the next part of that chart in the last 100 years or so, that line that I've circled there is not the edge of the chart, it's the trend, it's the actual data. And that matters because the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has a near linear relationship with the temperature on the planet. So when we look at that chart, we're now over 410 parts per million. Which is astonishing, really. Pre-industry, we were around 275 parts per million. That's the highest it's been for nearly 3 million years, possibly longer. And of course, 3 million years ago, the sea level was a great deal higher than it was today, so 20 meters higher, or even more than that 3 million years ago. So it's not unprecedented for us to be at this kind of concentration level in the history of the planet, but it certainly is in the last million years or so. And that's led to a lot of warming, as you would expect, given the linear relationship between CO2 and temperature. We warmed the planet by about 1.1 degrees centigrade. The average temperatures over the last 5 and 10 year periods have been the highest on record. And that means that climate change is with us now. It used to be a thing we talked about as being an issue for the future. It really isn't. It's having an impact right now. It's having an impact even on aviation right now. Clear air turbulence during cruise phase of flights is increasing due to climate change. It's increasing journey length and fuel consumption with it. So it has this impact that is all pervasive throughout the global economy. And of course, global system of nature that we have on this planet is threatened enormously by those changes. So the question is what we do about it. And again, on the global level, it's about this chart. This is the requirement really that was of the temperature goals that were set in Paris back in 2015. Net zero is the implication of those temperature goals. We have to get to a global outcome of net zero emissions. And that's just very simply the point when we will stop warming the planet by emitting those greenhouse gases. So net zero is the point when that will stop. And the implication of the temperature goals, which you can see here, the 2 degrees centigrade, well below 2 degrees centigrade, best efforts for 1.5 degrees centigrade as the temperature thresholds that were named in the Paris Agreement. The implication of that is that we need to get to a global outcome of net zero greenhouse gas emissions at some point in the 2070s. And if I just lay on top of that the UK commitment, hopefully you can see there that we are certainly in and amongst the most ambitious of the national commitments that I hope will help us steer towards that global outcome. It's not just about those national commitments, but of course they matter. Worth saying that the UK's target is for all greenhouse gas emissions. That's the toughest basis. So 2050 is our net zero goal for all greenhouse gases. That you get to CO2 only net zero in the early 2040s if you're on the journey to 2050 net zero. And I'm going to be talking about that in a second. And the happy story is that since we've been doing our work on net zero over the last 2 and 3 years, we've now got a club of big economies joining us on that goal. Mid-century net zero really is on the cards now. The EU, China, amazing, 2060 net zero goal. Korea, recently Japan, and now the US. So there is a feeling that we have more and more of global GDP under that net zero goal. And that, of course, requires very sharp emissions reductions. And that's what this chart is showing you, this kind of mountain that we've been scaling so far, this increase in global emissions that we've had over the course of the last 30 years and more. We've got to reverse that, this handbrake turn. And the quicker we do it, the better, because it's the cumulative emissions that will add, that in the end have the impact on temperature. So let's get to the UK and let's just think about aviation. So what is aviation's role in getting to net zero for the UK? Well, it's a relatively small role now, but the potential is there for it to become a relatively bigger issue in the future. So aviation was about 7% of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions in 2018. 93% of those aviation emissions were due to international aviation. More importantly, things are not heading in the right direction on aviation emissions, which is unlike other sectors in the economy. So aviation emissions have doubled, more or less, since 1990 in the UK. If we look at UK aviation emissions in 2018, the last year we have the good data for, they were largely the same as they were in 2008. What we've seen there is that a fall in domestic and military aviation emissions has been balanced by the rise in UK international aviation emissions. And of course, the really interesting thing that's happening behind that is that over that same decade, 2008 to 2018, we had the Climate Change Act in place over that decade. Total UK terminal passengers rose by 1/4. So what we're seeing is an increase in emissions that is more modest than the growth in passengers. And that's due, of course, to the changes in aviation itself. So we're loading more onto planes, we're more efficiently using those planes. So that's the historical position. What we've advised on recently is how the UK should get to net zero. And I'm not going to talk about this too much, but just to say that this is the UK-wide position. And really interesting from my perspective is that this is very much driven by the Climate Change Act that we have in the UK. What we have advised on in our most recent report in December is the orange box that you see here, this Carbon Budget 6, which is the first of the interim carbon budget targets that will be set since we reset the long-term goal to 2050. And the implication of it is that we have to reduce emissions by 2035 by about 80% from their 1990 baseline. Now that is the old 2050 target that we used to have until net zero was made the 2050 target about 18 months ago. So that's a measure of how much more ambition we need to see across the economy to get to net zero. That purple line that you see here is the path that we have advised, building on all the work that we've done in the CCC to build a whole economy assessment of the opportunities to cut emissions. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And it is a very challenging path, but overall a very achievable path, and I think a very appealing path too. And every sector has to play its role. So if we just look at those sectors, and this is not this is a demonstration rather than something I would like you to peer at, but this is the course of sectoral emissions using 2019 as the basis, and the proportional change as we see it over the course of the next 30 years. Hopefully you can see that every sector is playing its part in meeting net zero. The implication of our most recent assessment is that most sectors get to near zero emissions at some point over the 2040s, with a couple of notable exceptions. And I'll just bring up the aviation line now. So hopefully you can see that really does stand out in comparison with those other sectoral reductions. I'm going to be talking about the pathway that's implied by this in the remainder of this talk, but the main point I wanted to note just at this point is that aviation does look like the laggard here. We are used to talking about the 2 Fs being the real problem when it comes to the mid-century emissions that we'll have in the UK, and that's farming and flying. But actually, in our most recent work, we've seen more potential to cut agricultural emissions than in prior assessments. So it's leaving aviation standing out. Aviation's emissions are only falling by about 40% over that period here. The key thing is that even with that rapid action on aviation emissions that, of course, we would all want to see, it's likely to become the second or the third biggest source of emissions by 2050 in the UK. So it is a real challenge to tackle that. And as you're going to hear today, our view is that there are lots and lots of opportunities to reduce those aviation emissions, and they need to be prioritised now, and steps need to be taken to put those policies and strategies in place to achieve that kind of outcome. So I'm going to talk about our most recent work. And I just wanted to dwell on this because this is one of the great steps forward, I think, in the most recent work that we've produced. We've developed 3 illustrative scenarios for getting to net zero, which we call the engagement scenario, or headwind scenario, and an innovation scenario. I'm going to be going through those implications for aviation in the next slides. But they are really important because they show a different illustration of how the UK can get to the statutory goal of net zero by 2050. In our assessment, in every sector, we build different scenarios, each of them self-contained. The engagement scenario broadly is a scenario where we see more consumer response, so people are more responsive to the need to decarbonise. The innovation scenario broadly is a scenario that uses more technological innovation as the basis for decarbonisation. Headwinds is a world where it's heavier going, so the government is having to do a lot of the centrally planned infrastructure provision to get us to net zero. Each of them, though, gets to net zero by 2050. And if we take the best of them, the best of the characteristics from each of those scenarios, we have our tailwind scenario, which gets there actually sooner than the statutory date. That shaves nearly 10 years off the goal. It's our optimistic scenario, how we can get to net zero if everything goes well, I suppose you could say, and I'll be able to show you what that means for aviation in a second. So we use those 4 scenarios to try and build what we call the balanced pathway. That's our recommended pathway for emissions across the UK. We also have a recommended pathway for aviation emissions. And in that, what we're trying to do is to take an informed view of what we recommend the decisions should be across the economy in each sector. And I wouldn't normally labour this scenario work, except to say that I think it is important for aviation, because what you'll see in a second is how strikingly different those scenarios are for aviation in particular, more so than in other sectors of the economy. So let's talk about that next. And this is a complicated chart, but I'm going to talk you through it. There are lots of options for aviation. Broadly, we've got 3 things that we can consider in building a scenario for aviation for net zero. You've got demand management, we've got fleet efficiency improvements, and we've got sustainable aviation fuels. Those are our 3 options. And you can see on this chart that we're demonstrating how we look at those options in our assessments. For demand management, we've got a reduction in the annual number of passengers versus a counterfactual with unlimited passenger demand growth in our assessments. Demand management policies is something we'll come on to later, but it could take several forms. We're not really being too prescriptive about that, but we could think about things like carbon pricing, we could think about frequent flyer levies, fuel duty, possibly VAT or reforms to air passenger duty as being the kind of things that might drive demand management. We've also got to think about airport capacity, which has been a really topical issue recently, and I'll come on to that. When it comes to fleet efficiency, what we see is that that's being achieved through a combination of the modernisation of airspace and operational optimisation. We've also got aircraft passenger loadings. We're playing around with that in our assessments. Aircraft design as well, and also new engine efficiency improvements. What we're doing here largely is based on the Department for Transport's modelling. So we wanted to try and use that modelling in our most recent assessment. So much of what we talk about in our recent work, it fits very well with the way DFT views the world. And then with sustainable aviation fuels, these are the drop-in replacements for fossil fuels, fossil jet fuel, I beg your pardon. We've got lots of options here, which you can probably see here. Broadly, there's 4 sustainable aviation fuel production routes. Our analysis uses those 4 sustainable aviation fuel options to displace fossil jet fuel. Each option has its own deployment, its own profile, its own cost profile, based ultimately on the availability of feedstocks across the economy. So what we're trying to do is build a genuinely integrated view of this alongside all the other strategies across the economy to cut emissions. This is how that plays out across those scenarios I talked about. In the headwind scenario, emissions are about 25 megatons in 2050. That's about a third below where they were in 2018. In widespread engagement, we're assuming lower demand in 2050 than in 2018, due mainly to reduced business travel. That means emissions are 15 megatons, so quite a bit below where they were in 2018. In innovation, we've got much higher demand growth. That's possible because we've got technological development, which is allowing that demand growth without the emissions. So we're again about 15 megatons in 2050. And in tailwinds, which is our optimistic scenario, we combine the widespread engagement, so the demand reductions, with the technological improvements. That actually gets us almost to zero emissions, to 1 megaton under a tailwind scenario in 2050. The balanced pathway is the one we're going to be talking about for the last part of this section. That's our recommended one. Hopefully you can see on that table how those choices play out in our analysis. And this is what they look like when it comes to emissions. Hopefully you can see the main thing that I wanted to see here is that the range of outcomes that come from those choices. Black line is our baseline. So that's what we think would happen if we were to stop in an imaginary world trying to do climate policy, and you get a very substantial increase in aviation emissions over the next 30 years if that were the case. In grey, I've shown the uncertainty from COVID, and acknowledging that it is a major uncertainty, we assume that the industry doesn't recover passenger numbers until 2024. But there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about that. That's broadly in line with industry's assessments too. We have our three illustrative scenarios. Again, only tailwinds. The highly optimistic scenario gets close to zero emissions. That's the yellow line there. And our balanced pathway, which is the thick purple one there. That's what we should talk about now. So this, I think, sets out quite nicely what we've just recommended to the government. This is our recommended net zero pathway for aviation, and crucially how we see it being achieved. The purple stripes are what we call the carbon abatement. So that's taking us from that baseline, the black line, down to the purple line. So we see aviation returning to the pre-pandemic demand levels by 2024. After that, you get this gradual decline over time in emissions due to those three components of the strategy I talked about. So on demand management, our recommended pathway allows for some limited growth in aviation demand over the period to 2050, but less than business as usual. So we're allowing for 25% increase in demand by 2050 compared to 2018 levels. If it was unconstrained, it'd be more like 65%. So that's a measure of how much constraint we need to see in there. We assume that, unlike in the baseline, that occurs without any net increase in UK airport capacity. So any expansion is balanced by reductions in capacity elsewhere in the UK. That's an important point. We've looked and drawn on our demand assumptions from the UK's Climate Assembly, which is a process commissioned by Westminster. That assembly recommended 25 to 50% demand growth by 2050 from 2018 levels. So depending on how quickly technology progresses, the weighted average of the scenario votes there was 24%. So we're basically right bang on what the Climate Assembly recommended. When it comes to efficiency improvements, the fuel efficiency per passenger of aviation is assumed to improve at about 1.4% per annum, compared to 0.7% per annum in the baseline. That includes 9% of total aircraft distance in 2050 being flown by hybrid electric aircraft, just to deal with that one now. A quarter of jet fuel by 2050 is made from sustainable low carbon sources. And then just on sustainable aviation fuels, they're about 25% of the liquid fuel that's being consumed in 2050. 2/3 of that's coming from biofuels. The remainder is coming from carbon neutral synthetic jet fuel. So that gives you a sense of how we see it playing out overall. This is a chart you might not have seen before, a really striking chart. Shows you how the fuel for aviation is being supplied on that recommended pathway. The vast majority is the purple bit. And I wanted to make this point. We in our assessment, we are continuing to use petroleum as the primary source of jet fuel in the future. By 2050, when you look across the whole of the UK economy, this is really the only sector that's using petroleum as a fuel in that way. But it is on that steady decline from the late 2020s that I talk about. And it's complemented, of course, by the coloured wedges above there. That's the sustainable fuels coming into the mix, again, mostly from bioresources. And this is the other implication of the work that we've done. Because we don't get to zero emissions in the recommended pathway for aviation, there's an implied need for greenhouse gas removals alongside it, which you can see on this chart. So it's going to entail having a plan for how verifiable greenhouse gas removals can act as an offset for the residual emissions over time. So after we've done all the efficiency improvements and the low carbon fuels and the demand side measures, this is what's left. So those offsets could, in principle, be delivered through an international mechanism. So it could be CORSIA, for example, or it could be a domestic policy. But we're going to need to see removals that are genuinely additional within as robust a governance framework as we can manage. Really important points to make about these greenhouse gas removals. There will not be unlimited access to those offsets. So the potential for deploying them is ultimately limited by the constraint of land and resources that we have globally. Really important point. Options like growing trees, afforestation, do have really low costs, but are limited in scope. So we assume that those opportunities are going to be taken in any eventuality, and that therefore they shouldn't be used as a way of growing the additional scope or as an offset for positive emissions elsewhere. So we in our assessment have described that the most appropriate option for aviation emissions is something that we call highly scalable offsets. And in our work, that means coupling bioenergy resources grown in the UK, used in an energy process with carbon capture, and then stored in geological storage, probably in the seas off the shores of the UK. That is a process, BECCS, as it's sometimes known, bioenergy with CCS. That is a process that is an engineered removal and something that the UK can do very well, we think. And it's an offset market that we can create here domestically in the UK. We could eventually be a hub for those kind of those international credits if they ever come about. So it's something the UK should do. And crucially, greenhouse gas reduction using that route for offsets is something that could be funded through a requirement on aviation to pay for those removals. So that's a question for government. A policy question is whether government wants to try and mandate that kind of change in the future. So it could, of course, choose to do that through the tax system, or it could choose to encourage the aviation sector to marry up with those offsets themselves. What we said is, given the uncertainties here, that DfT should try and set a net emissions trajectory to net zero for aviation, which would be that red line that you see there, and that would include the need for removals overall. So that's the story. That's the kind of story of the sector itself getting to net zero. The really cool thing is that we can do something with all this analysis we've not been able to do before. We can now build you a profile of the investments that are necessary across every sector, actually, to get to net zero. And this is the investment profile for civil aviation. This is the CapEx that we think would deliver the right outcome, as I've just described it. It requires extra investment by the aviation sector itself to the tune of about £500 million per year. It varies over the course of the next 30 years, as you'd expect. But here, what I'm showing you is the additional CapEx in our recommended pathway compared to a baseline, the baseline where we're not acting on climate change at all. So that is mainly the higher costs of more efficient aircraft that you're seeing there. That's the investment cost. We're not assuming any costs of savings from reductions or any financial costs of savings from the reductions in demand or the baseline trajectory versus the baseline trajectory. So that's the CapEx. And the really interesting thing is we can also look at Opex. So this is the Opex impact of all that investment. Really neat to be able to describe it in this way. Below the line, hopefully you can see the Opex savings that come from that CapEx. This is the implication of the investment, is that there is efficiency savings from the new aircraft. That's the capital costs of improved aircraft efficiency, crucially, are a big number, but they're more than offset by those fuel savings that you see below the line. There are also some additional operating costs compared to that, the baseline. So that's due obviously to the higher cost of sustainable aviation fuels. But the really exciting news, drawing this together with the need to pay for those greenhouse gas removals that I referred to, is that I think the consumer offering here is pretty appealing overall. So just to give you a sense of that, let's look at a return ticket from London to New York in 2050. Sustainable aviation fuels might add 35 quid to that return ticket. We can expect to knock off £21 of fuel savings through the improved efficiency that comes from the things that we're suggesting should be invested in. If the full decarbonisation is paid for using GHG removals to offset the residual emissions, as I've just described, that's going to add a further £41. So the net added cost to that ticket of genuine net zero flying is only £56 on that return ticket to New York. And I think that's really interesting and something we might want to talk about. And that leads us nicely to the last section, which is on policy. So again, I've drawn from our most recent advice to government here. And just before I go through those bullets, even just to say a few things that just to kind of frame up the policy challenge, and making it happen is exactly what I think we should be trying to do. And the first thing is just to say that this question of how the UK approaches aviation emissions is not, I think, going to be resolved until we see a better basis for ministers to take their actions. So we are suggesting very strongly that it is important that international aviation emissions are part of the UK target framework. Now, aviation is global very clearly in its nature, and therefore the challenge of tackling aviation needs to have a global solution too. And that is a really important implication. So we want to make sure that you understand that. This is not something where we're looking for the UK to unilaterally take a view on how to tackle this with the rest of the world leaving us behind. But we do see a need for the UK to cover off its emissions properly with a target framework that covers international aviations effectively. That said, the UK has played a real important role in ICAO, and we don't see a conflict with setting an ambitious domestic goal here whilst trying to drive progress in the international forum. So what we're saying in effect in our most recent advice is push hard on the international mechanisms through ICAO, but model the changes that we need to see globally at home. Demonstrate domestically that we have a workable model that can be extended to the international market. Lead that. So we're not seeking to undermine the international forums or the mechanisms in our advice here. Far from it. We're more interested in seeing a clearer set of motivations for ministers in the UK and in other countries to make CORSIA work, or whatever comes next. There is lots and lots of opportunity in the forthcoming aviation decarbonisation strategy to set a UK policy for all of this. That's what we've been promised by DFT. And of course, we're going to need to set the 6th carbon budget itself. Ministers have got to table that to Parliament later this year. And it has to include international aviation emissions, as far as we are concerned. We do see at the moment significant gaps in the policy framework for aviation in the UK, and that is a major challenge. So let's just quickly go through what we've recommended. This is what we said in December. Firstly, include international aviation emissions within UK climate targets when the 6th carbon budget is set. Absolutely essential to do that, because at some point they will have to come under the target framework we have domestically. Secondly, set that net zero goal for UK aviation in the aviation decarbonisation strategy that's forthcoming, and that's the industry goal too. So this is really aligning with what the industry have said they'll deliver. We would like to see ministers work with ICAO to set that long-term goal for aviation in the right place so that we are consistent with the Paris Agreement. It will of course involve strengthening CORSIA and aligning that scheme, or whatever replaces it, properly with the Paris Agreement. We are going to need to assess airport capacity in the context of net zero, and that means, in our assessment at least, that there should be no net expansion of UK airport capacity, at least until the sector is on track to deliver or outperform its net emissions trajectory. And that's a key point about the need for DFT to set that net emissions trajectory out for aviation. We've looked at the issues of non-CO2 effects, and we do see a challenge there. And that's mainly a challenge that we're not ready yet to offer a full set of recommendations on, but we're keen to see mitigation options put in place earlier for the non-CO2 emissions from aviation. And of course, they'll need to be tackled alongside the climate targets themselves. The main challenge here is go as quickly as you can on cutting emissions from aviation in the round, and we'll have less of a problem on the non-CO2 effects as well. And lastly, we need a more explicit policy on sustainable aviation fuel. The RTFO is really not sufficient to get us there. So that's going to need a different kind of policy. And what we've recommended in particular is a mandate to blend, a blending mandate, also better support for commercial production of sustainable aviation fuels here in the UK, which is partly about innovation, but actually mainly about deploying those solutions overall. And we do see an enduring need for innovation support and demonstration support for the whole range of technological innovations that are needed to get to that pathway that I've just referred to. And this is the very last slide that I'll show you today. I've had a few gremlins this side, so I hope it's worked out for you. But just summing up, if we have the right efforts at ICAO, if we have an ambitious aviation decarbonisation strategy from UK ministers, and of course a package of domestic policies here in the UK to match that, and if we have the parallel progress that we really need to see on a mechanism for deploying greenhouse gas removals in the UK, We think it's entirely possible to put UK aviation emissions on track for net zero, and that could happen even over the course of the next year and more. So that's really exciting, because this shows you the kind of steps that we need to see play out on the basis of all of that in the next 20 to 30 years. Broadly, it's about 2 stages. From now to the mid-2030s, it's of course about the recovery from COVID, working out where we stand on demand there. It's about modernising airspace use, saving fuel, of course, through that, doing the innovation and the demonstration of sustainable fuels and the new aircraft technology over the next 15 years, getting the bioenergy and CCS market up and running with commercial investment there so that it can be leaned on by aviation, supported, of course, by public funds in the initial part of that. And then from 2035 onwards, it's really about rolling all of that out. So growing our use of sustainable aviation fuels, electric hybrid aircraft coming along over the 2040s, BECS, bioenergy with CCS, and even possibly direct air capture, helping to do the engineered greenhouse gas removals that we'll need at a decent scale to offset aviation emissions into the future, supported, I hope, by a willing aerospace industry. And if we do all of that, I really do think this is quite an appealing offer. It's something that hopefully the industry can align behind and ministers can put in place. And hopefully it will be a step towards us talking about aviation emissions in a more constructive way than some of the discourse when it comes to climate change in aviation that we've had over the last couple of years. That's certainly my ambition. Now, I'm going to make sure that these slides are available for you afterwards if you want to peer at any of this in more detail. But just a final plug for what I said at the top of this, that they're all summarized in a really excellent document that you can find on our website. Hopefully we can pass around to you, looking at that aviation specific advice that sits behind the things I've talked about today. But I'll end there, Brian, and I'll just try and come back to you so we can have a little bit of Q and answer.
Good. Thank you very much. Very comprehensive and extremely interesting. Unsurprisingly, we've got a large list of questions. So I'm going to segment things. I think we'll start off by talking about fuels. There's a lot of interest in demand management and including airport infrastructure, and then some of the broader questions on the end-to-end case. But let's start on fuels. Airbus, for example, announced that their primary research mission for future propulsion would be hydrogen aircraft, certainly at longer ranges. What's your view on the plausibility of hydrogen, its distribution, and maybe, whether there's any stimulation likely to come from domestic heating, which could be helpful?
Yeah, it's such a good question and so topical, and it's also very controversial. So the role of hydrogen generally is maybe worth saying is something that we, for a long time actually in the CCC have been championing. That it's a really important element to the UK's climate strategy, and not just the UK, of course. It is primarily across the economy used as a complement to electrification. So the primary strategy that we see playing out across the UK is to electrify the economy as much as possible, and then of course to supply that electricity from increasingly decarbonised means. That happens to be also a strategy that is cheaper and cheaper over time. So one of the other big insights that comes from that is how much cheaper it is now to decarbonise, thanks to the fact that we've seen these falls in the price of electricity. But electricity only gets you so far, and hydrogen is the complement to that, if I can put it that way. And it has a number of roles, but the two key roles that we see it playing in the future are in industry, where it's a very useful replacement for fossil fuels that at present need to be combusted for high temperature industrial use, and crucially in long distance transport. So we see that role. It's not a free pass, sadly, because you've got to work out where the hydrogen comes from. So you can either deliver it through electrolysis, which is a zero carbon process, as long as the electricity is zero carbon, or you can take a fossil fuel, put it through a process, turn it into hydrogen and capture the carbon. But once you've got that hydrogen, you can do lots of things with it. And we are quite willing to see that happen in the aviation sector. There's no issue there. I think the problem with the aviation sector is how quickly we can see it develop. So in the time frame we need to see it, it's still only going to come on stream over the 2040s, we would say, as an option. So it doesn't really detract from the need to do the things that I've described on demand management, for example, over the course of the next 20 years or so. I would love to see it, though, come through. On the committee, we've got a few skeptics about it, including notably Julia King, who's worked extensively in the aerospace industry, who's less sure it can play as big a role as some in the industry have said it could. So It's quite interesting discussing it with Julia. She's someone who's really followed it all the way through, and you probably saw I deliberately put that chart up showing how fuel demand changes over the course of the next 30 years, and the majority of it still is coming from fossil fuels and petroleum over that period. I'd love to be wrong on that, though, of course.
Yeah, of course, a lot of this depends on travel patterns, and as you said at the beginning, how aviation recovers from COVID. But for example, in Airbus's work, they posit that short haul by 2035, short haul will generally be, or I shouldn't say short haul, I should say low distance flying should be electric. Then there's a band of hybrid where you'd have electric and hydrocarbon fuel, and then beyond that, ultimately a hybrid with hydrogen and electric, maybe. I mean, do you segment the nature of aviation's operating patterns in that way by sort of positing which fuel and which perhaps combination of fuels is most appropriate?
Not to that degree. I mean, it's important to say that what we're trying to do is really satisfy ourselves that there are options, and then we try and find a way through all of that by selecting them. And of course, I expect we'll be refining our recommendations over the. We're not going to stop today, so this will continue. But we don't get down to that kind of level. What we're looking for is to be assured that there is enough in that. So we lean more heavily on hybrids, for example. But again, I would love to be wrong on that. It could easily be that we've got pure electric doing some of the short haul flights by the 2040s. Again, I'll go back to my earlier point, though, that these innovations are great, but they're unlikely to be a major assistance to the 2050 goal. So yeah. It's more about making sure that they're being developed so that post 2050 we benefit from them.
And then there's a lot of interest in synthetic aviation fuel, obviously. In terms of your chart where you showed the variations of different approaches to synthetic, it has a lot of appeal to the industry because essentially storage and distribution is not that dissimilar from a hydrocarbon fuel. But if you were, well, first of all, what would you say to Shell and BP to stimulate their investment? And if you were advising them, which set of fuels do you think have most potential for the future?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't think Shell and BP need to be encouraged to look at this. I mean, I think that this, and I well understand the appeal of them. And I describe them as drop-in replacements for fossil jet fuel. So that's the way that we view them, and we like them too. It's just that the problem is that we've got, in particular, an issue of how you use bioresources. So we see those available bioresources across the economy as a constrained resource over the course of the next 30 years. And that means that potentially they're going to be quite an expensive resource. So we've got about 2/3 of sustainable aviation fuels based on the bioresources. But the exciting stuff is the synthetic jet fuel. If we can get that going, then we're not so constrained there in our assessment of where the supply will come from. So I think probably that's where the really interesting stuff is, but it's not a free pass there either. So if we're producing synthetic jet fuel via direct air capture, for example, that requires electricity. So we need to be clear that there is sufficient electricity out there to support that process. So again, it's not an easy thing to say that there's an obvious place to push if you're in the supply of those fuels. But I would like to see us less looking to the bioresources and more to the synthetic resources if we can, because it's less land constrained. That's kind of main issue, I suppose, for me.
Yeah, I mean, on that score, the trade group Synthetic Sustainable Aviation put a lot of weight on synthetic fuels, and in their mix of measures, they believe they could get down to net zero, albeit with some carbon pricing offset. But they figured they could get to net zero by 2050, and yet, you're positing that that's not in the art of the possible. So,
well, I think we can almost get there. I mean, our tailwind scenario is designed to be this kind of really, if I can put it this way, it's a racy scenario. This kind of everything, you get everything goes well, and that almost gets to zero. So it gets to 1 megaton by 2050, which I think we can call zero. But interestingly, even in that scenario, we've only got about about half of the half of fuels are synthetic in that. So it's I mean, even in that scenario, we're not wholly reliant on synthetic fuels.
Yeah, let's just move on to demand management. And you mentioned pricing in terms of synthetic aviation fuel, etc., difference to a transatlantic ticket. But what about a plausible carbon tax? What sort of level do you think that would difference that would make to the cost of a transatlantic ticket?
Yeah, so I mean that's kind of implied in my calculations. So I mean, the level of it is not something I really want to speculate on, because I think it will depend on you know, what's going on in the wider market, and I think it's a fool's errand to say what the carbon price should be in 2050, for example. But I do think it's an important part of the mix, and of course it's a difficult thing to levy on an international fuel, an international transport sector. So that's going to be one of the areas. Now, potentially this will be a discussion that for the COP this year as well. You can see that already the UK administration is interested in surfacing broader questions of carbon pricing, and this idea that you might get a club of countries trying to do the right thing on carbon pricing. We've tried that before, but I don't know if that kind of push has really been there from the diplomatic effort, at least. So I see it as an important complement to a broader set of strategies that include technological innovation, but demand management has still got to be in there as part of the mix. And carbon pricing is one of the things that could help with that. But the other thing that is more straightforwardly, what are we doing with our airport capacity? So we see more straightforward ways to manage that demand, I suppose, that are less penal to the consumer. I would much rather actually see a direct link between the sector, the aviation sector itself, and the embryonic sector for greenhouse gas removals, those BECS, the credits that I talked about. There's a symbiotic link between those two things, and crucially, you can do it through two ways. You can establish that symbiotic link now, and you know, you get the commercial force of innovation playing out, and the cost reductions will come with it. Or you can do it through taxation, which is another way of handling it. Frankly, I'm happier with the former, because I think we'll get better outcome at the end of that. I think the aviation sector itself has a stake in seeing that removals market grow. So I'd rather that was a proxy for that tax, and would be managed, I think, better for it if it was being managed by the sector itself.
Yeah, the indications are that the aerospace sector is indeed investing in that way, collaborating in that way, particularly Rolls-Royce, for example, with Shell and BP.
I think just one point on that, Brian, and it didn't really come out in my presentation, but certainly in our view, that is a cheaper strategy than developing, you know, 100% synthetic fuels, for example. I know there's lots of interest in changing drop-in fuels, because for obvious reasons, you don't have to change all the other infrastructure that goes with it. But actually, that strategy of using fossil fuels but having a genuine offset for it, you know, a scalable engineered offset, one that it can be generally described as an offset, not just forestry, is really appealing, actually, when you look at the cost overall. Sure,
yeah. And similarly in demand management, the impact on airports. Talisman is the next runway at Heathrow. So, I mean, how do you see government squaring that very difficult circle?
Yeah, I mean, I always try and avoid, trying to work out how to answer that question. I try very hard to avoid commenting on whether we should have that third runway at Heathrow. I mean, the crucial point, you could put it simply, we could have it, but we couldn't have much else. So I think that's the implication of it. I don't know whether government will ever get to the point of having to actually really grapple with this issue, because it seems to me it's now kicked firmly into the long grass again. What I would like to see is the department really taking hold of this issue, and that's really the point about having a DFT-led path for net emissions over the course of the next 30 years, which accommodates those greenhouse gas removals that we need to see as well. Now, then we can talk about airport capacity, and we can really have a go at understanding what would need to be done. Because you could have more capacity in the future if there are more greenhouse gas removals. And one of the reasons that we're so keen on seeing international aviation emissions come into the carbon targets that we have in the UK is that we think it would force ministers to properly look at that kind of trade-off, to really focus on that idea that, you know, the basis of the growth of demand for aviation in the future and the growth of airport capacity might need to be a fully functioning greenhouse gas removals market, for example, in this country. At the moment, ministers conduct that issue because they're not really formally part of the target. And that's something that's just got to change. So we didn't even offer advice to ministers on the sixth carbon budget that included a non-international aviation and shipping option. So that for me is really important. I think it will flush out a better sense of what minister strategies are overall for airport capacity.
Can we move on to the sort of end-to-end problem? The first thing, I guess, is the science of aeronautics has expanded enormously over the last 50 years, and now we have a hugely vibrant space sector. Does any of that factor into your thinking on the way in which a carbon budget should look?
Yeah, so we do try and allow for that kind of innovation as it comes along. I've already made this point before, but I will again, that we see lots of opportunity for technological innovations in the aerospace sector itself over the course of the next 30 years, but not in the immediate term. And of course, the turnover of stock in the aviation sector is not a quick process. So we're working against that, I suppose. So actually, one of the reasons for doing the innovation scenario, as I described it, is that that's our attempt to flesh out a scenario where we see more technological innovation than in other scenarios. So we're trying to allow for that. I expect there will be a lot of innovation over the course of the next 30 years. And in fact, I encourage it. It would be brilliant to see those innovations come along. But the crucial thing is that the climate can't really wait for some of that to be rolled out. So we're going to need to work hard to cut emissions, even though those innovations are coming down the pipe. And I'm excited about them, but they need to be here sooner than 2040 if they're going to make a big impact on the kind of things we've talked about today.
And a similar but different question on the end-to-end aspect, something that's leveled at the automotive industry with electric vehicles, that actually, when you take the totality of the end-to-end process, the production of batteries and all of the manufacturing processes, then you may get a different answer about the degree to which your electric car is really environmentally friendly. So in general, in developing your analysis and providing your advice, to what extent can that play in?
So we try and look at that too. Now, it's important to see that the basis of the targets that we have in the UK is what we call production emissions, which is basically the emissions that we're producing within the geographical boundary of the UK. So that's the UN rulebook that leads to that outlook. I think it's also the right outlook, though. So, the primary task here in every economy around the world is to deal with the production emissions that we, of course, we're responsible for directly. But there's a bigger issue here about our carbon footprint, and it would extend in this particular discussion to the embodied carbon in the aircraft themselves and in all the infrastructure we need to support the aircraft and the aviation sector. And I don't think that has nearly enough of focus. I mean, it's slightly beyond our statutory role to advise on it, but we've done that in other sectors. So we've looked in particular, you mentioned the impact of the embodied carbon in the electric cars we might have in the future. We have done a piece of work on that. So I think it falls to the aviation sector again to think about that. And of course, it's a genuinely international problem. And particularly amplified because those planes are only being produced in a handful of places. Yeah. So the burden falls primarily on those economies that are involved in the production processes, and they tend to be richer economies. So for this particular challenge, I feel less concerned about it because really those economies should be in a position to deal with the emissions that they're responsible for, and those embodied carbon emissions in the production of the aircraft especially is something that you could expect the EU and the UK and the US government in particular to have to deal with.
And a question about the sort of international approach that you're now able to take about aviation. And you talked about strengthening CORSIA, and CORSIA had a bit of a bumpy berth, and then the datum year, of course, was anything other than a normal year. Is that something that actually is going to be useful in the near term, the sort of thing that will convince ministers that actually there is an international approach possible here? Because as you well know, from Rio onwards, the notion of now it's my turn to pollute has often been played around the table. But CORSIA is a very important overarching binding process potentially. and China, of course, showing helpful interest in complying.
Yeah, so I had my technical gremlins at the point I was trying to talk about this particular issue, but there's a subtlety to what we've advised to governments that I don't think is always understood, not least by Department for Transport, that although we are advocating a domestic response on international aviation emissions, primarily the mechanism to deliver that kind of domestic reduction is still, we think, primarily an international one. So we would like to see CORSIA work, or CORSIA's replacement. I have to say I'm suspicious about its ability to deliver those near-term reductions that you referred to, Brian. It's more about what comes after that. So the kind of key point for me is, if we're going to see a meaningful mechanism for international aviation emissions develop, then why not model that at home, given the potential there is in the UK to do those engineered removals that I talked about in particular. So we don't really see a conflict between the domestic strategy for dealing with all aviation emissions here in the UK and the international one. In fact, we think the UK ministers will be in an even stronger position to play an important role in those negotiations if we've got that kind of domestic market established. I know that's a difficult thing to try and describe, but it's not about us taking a unilateral approach to this. I think that's the point I'm really trying to make. We understand entirely the competitiveness issues that may follow that. So it's really about saying that we do have the potential to develop the kind of market that we would need in the future. Those mechanisms will have greater teeth in the future. We in the UK have all the components of that ready to go, so we might as well try it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Time is running against us, and I'm really grateful for such a broad expose of where the sixth carbon budget is rooted and its part for aviation. And I think that's it's striking how much more granular it is than the previous budgets in this respect. But you can take some assurance from the fact at our recent climate change conference, where we had panels with CEOs of airlines, of aerospace manufacturers, and of airport operators. My concern had always been that the impact of COVID, the need to harbour cash, etc., would act as, dare I say, an excuse for taking our eyes off this objective. Actually, the reverse was true. And in one way or another, all of them made the point that this is mandatory to us because our passengers demand it, our staff demand it, our investors demand it, and before very long the government will demand it. So there is no pushback from there. And in a sense, in quite the other direction, there's a lot of stimulation by the prospect of advanced technology being embraced into aircraft design and being able to forge ahead with low carbon aircraft. Everybody near the coalface respects that there is no technological solution to this by 2050, but we can certainly get along the way. And it is, I think most people will welcome that we're taking an international approach now, because it's always seemed slightly bizarre, even under the European scheme, that we didn't take that into approach. So really comprehensive briefing. I'm really grateful for that, and thank you so much for your time. And just moving on to the next briefing we have, it's by Carissa Christensen from Bryce Technology, US company, who's going to give us her perspective on the future space economy and the satellite market, and particularly interested in the barriers to entry, maybe for small companies, etc. Space is very much in mind at the moment. The 7 minutes of terror that we were all able to witness last Thursday as the Mars rover went through the Mars atmosphere. And on the climate change front, of interest will be our next conference, which is mitigating the climate impact of non-CO2, aviation's low-hanging fruit. And you'll be aware that there are aspects such as NOx, such as contrails, such as operating patterns, which are worthy of scrutiny in one of our conferences. Promises to be a really good one. They're very popular. It is an important subject as we run up to COP26. So my thanks to all of you for joining. We've had a really good audience tonight. Thank you for the questions. We covered a lot of ground, and have a good evening. Good night.